Imagine coming home after 20 years of marriage, only to find that your wife, the woman you trusted completely, has been sneaking around with your son's best friend. She's 45, he's barely 19, and their secret was as close as the couch in your own living room. One careless text from M, winky face, exposed everything, unraveling the life you thought was untouchable. She doesn't deny it, either. Instead, she suggests an open marriage to meet her needs. But that's not the worst part. The shock of it all sends her into a downward spiral, losing her grip on reality, murmuring to herself and staring at doors like someone's about to walk through them. Soon, you're not just a betrayed husband. You're a single dad putting your wife in a psychiatric clinic while your son, devastated, can't even bear to say her name. All because of a betrayal you never saw coming. This isn't just infidelity. It's the implosion of a family, shattered by secrets and left to pick up the pieces. My name's Joel, 47 years old, and married for nearly 20 years to Ann. We live in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago. I work as a project manager for a construction company and Ann teaches high school English. We've built a solid life together, modest house, 2 kids, and even a little cabin we visit during summers up in Wisconsin. Life's been a smooth ride until recently. Lately, I started noticing a shift. Ann's mood swings were sharper, her patience thinner, and her phone was glued to her hand, even at home. But what really started gnawing at me was how she interacted with Mike, our son Danny's best friend. Mike's 19, college sophomore, and one of those clean-cut, all-American types you see in magazine ads. He's always been like family, practically another son to us, with his parents often away on business. It was subtle at first, smiling a bit too long when he cracked a joke, her laughter louder, that almost giddy sound you hear in high school hallways. I thought I was just imagining things until last Friday evening. We were all watching a movie together, one of those summer blockbusters Danny picked, and I noticed and kept leaning over to Mike, whispering things and nudging him playfully. I tried to brush it off, but it's not something you easily ignore when it's right there, right under your own roof. After Danny fell asleep on the couch and offered to drive Mike home. It was almost midnight, and I thought she was just being polite. But as I watched them leave, I noticed her hand lingering on his shoulder, just a little too long. And I have always been close, closer than most, I'd say. Even after all these years, we kept up little routines to stay connected. We'd share our first cup of coffee together in the mornings, and no matter what chaos had gone on during the day, we'd take a quiet walk around the neighborhood at night. Those walks, those were our thing. We'd joke about growing old together, being the wrinkly couple still strolling around the block with our dog. And with each year, I believed it more. We went through the ups and downs, the whole lot of it. From tight budgets when we were younger to the medical bills for my hearing loss, which started in my late 30s, and was my rock through it. That was the thing about her. No matter how much I struggled, she was always there to pick me up. Even when my hearing worsened and I started missing chunks of conversations. Or worse, when the kids would ask me something and I'd just nod along, clueless. It frustrated her sometimes, but she'd quickly catch herself and laugh it off. She'd always tell me she respected my strength and patience, but in reality, she's the one who had more patience than anyone I knew. I remember just a couple of months ago when I'd spaced out on our anniversary dinner plans because I missed part of the conversation. She just laughed, ordered in Thai food, and we made it a cozy night on the couch instead. That was us, able to adjust, to bend without breaking. What's worse about this situation with Mike, though, is that our lives were so intertwined with his. I watched that kid grow up. He's been around since Danny was in kindergarten. He spent more nights at our place than I can count, joining in on family dinners and tagging along on road trips to the cabin. I felt like I was teaching him things a father might teach a son, everything from chopping wood to patching up drywall. We trusted him, and I thought I knew and well enough to trust her without question. But lately, I'm catching things that feel off. I can't shake the feeling, no matter how hard I try to reason it away. And has been more distant, and it's not something I can brush off as my imagination. It's a real, tangible change. And as much as I wanted to deny it, that sense of betrayal was creeping in, strong and bitter. A couple of weeks after that night with Mike, we packed up for our annual cabin trip. Just me, and Danny, with Mike tagging along, of course. He'd been joining us every summer since high school. I figured the fresh air, lake swims, and bonfire nights might clear my head. Maybe I was overthinking things, and being out there in the open would remind me what really mattered. But from the first day, something was off, and kept glancing at her phone, smiling at random messages, and slipping away to take calls. Normally, she'd unplug during these trips. It was our thing, disconnecting from the world for a week and just enjoying each other. But now, her phone seemed like an extension of her hand. I caught her one evening, leaning against the deck railing, phone pressed to her ear, her voice hushed. When she noticed me, she laughed it off, saying it was just a call from her friend, Lila, about some women's book club drama. She smiled that familiar smile, the one that usually put me at ease. But this time it felt rehearsed. One night, after Danny had gone to bed, we lit a fire outside. Mike was next to and on the log bench, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and laughed easily, tossing her hair back, and I noticed how her gaze lingered on him as he spoke. They were laughing at some story Mike was telling about a girl from college, and I felt like a stranger, left out of an inside joke I'd never be in on. I told myself I was being paranoid. I mean, what kind of man suspects his wife around his son's best friend? It was embarrassing, and I didn't want to be that guy, the insecure husband seeing ghosts. But a few nights later, something happened that rattled me. I'd stayed up late, enjoying the quiet after everyone went to bed. Just as I was turning in, I saw his phone on the kitchen counter, screen lighting up with a text. I didn't mean to look, but my eyes caught the name M and a winking emoji. For a second, I just stood there like a fool, wondering if I was really seeing what I thought I was. A message preview popped up. Can't wait, winky face. My stomach dropped. I wanted to pick up the phone, to read every word and find out what was going on, but I didn't. I just stood there, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. What if I was wrong? What if I was letting paranoia ruin the one solid thing in my life? But there was no ignoring the knot in my gut or the shame creeping up the back of my neck. The next day, I tried to shake it off, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. I pushed myself to be calm, to act like everything was fine. But as I watched them, I couldn't escape this feeling, a nagging doubt that just wouldn't let go. Every smile, every shared glance between them became a barb. And the worst part? I couldn't confront her. Not without proofs. Not without risking my whole family over something that might be nothing. Inside, I felt like a dam ready to burst. By the end of the trip, I couldn't hold it in any longer. The constant glances, the laughter, the text from him, all of it had built up until I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. My mind was stuck on replay, going over every suspicious interaction like I was watching a bad movie on loop. So, on our last night at the cabin, after Danny and Mike were asleep, I took a deep breath and pulled an aside. And I need to ask you something, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes narrowed, the first flicker of tension flashing across her face. Sure, what is it? She asked, forcing a calm smile. I swallowed, feeling my hands tremble. It's about Mike. And you. I mean, I've noticed how close you've been lately, and the way you look at him, and those texts I saw. Look, I need you to be honest with me. Is there something going on? Her face twisted in an expression I'd never seen before, equal parts anger and amusement. Are you kidding me, Joel? She laughed, a short, cutting sound. You think I'm involved with Mike? He's our son's friend. Do you even hear yourself? I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck, but I pushed forward. Then explain it to me. Why are you acting so distant, always sneaking off with your phone, whispering to him during every family dinner? I know I'm not making this up, and I might not hear everything, but I'm not blind. She scoffed, her voice sharpening. Oh, so that's what this is about? I can't believe you're throwing this paranoid nonsense at me just because you don't catch every conversation. You're actually accusing me because you're insecure about your hearing? That's low, Joel. Really low. I blinked, caught off guard. And I'm not bringing up my hearing. I'm just saying I know what I saw. And the text from, who's that in? Explain it. Her eyes flashed, and she let out an exasperated sigh. Do you even know what you're talking about? I mean, God, this is insane. You saw a random text on my phone, and now you think I'm sneaking around? I swear, Joel, this is exactly why you've been so out of touch with everyone lately. You can't even hear half the things going on around you, and now you're making up stories to fill in the blanks. It's sad. Her words hit like a slap. Don't twist this around, Anne. This isn't about my hearing. It's about the way you've been acting. I'm not deaf to the fact that something's off. She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms. You sound like a lunatic, Joel. Do you honestly think I'd risk everything for some kid? You're imagining things. Or worse, maybe you're just going crazy in that paranoid little mind of yours. Her words seared, each one cutting deeper. I opened my mouth to respond, to press further, but she didn't give me the chance. She shook her head and sighed, as if she were dealing with a child. Look, I can't even talk to you when you're like this. It's like I'm married to someone completely irrational. Maybe you should see a doctor, Joel. Maybe they can fix whatever's making you think up these ridiculous accusations. She stormed off before I could even respond, leaving me standing there, hollowed out, feeling every inch the fool she'd painted me to be. For the first time, I felt like I was questioning my own sanity. Was she right? Had I been so insecure that I'd let my imagination run wild? The morning after we got back from the cabin, and barely spoke to me, she busied herself with unpacking and laundry, moving through the house as if I wasn't even there. I didn't bother trying to talk to her. The way she dismissed me last night, the way she'd made me feel like I was losing my grip was still fresh, and I wasn't in the mood to be gaslit all over again. Once she left for a coffee date with Lila, I had the house to myself. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my cold coffee, still trying to make sense of everything. Part of me felt crushed, like maybe I really had gone insane. But then, a small, relentless voice in the back of my mind kept nudging me. You know something's off. You know she's lying. I decided to check our home security footage. We'd installed a few cameras around the house last year after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood, mostly aimed at the entry points, the front door, back door, and one that gave a partial view of the living room. I knew there was a good chance the footage wouldn't capture much, but I had to try. I pulled up the footage from the week before the cabin trip, back when I'd first started noticing Anne's strange behavior. I fast-forwarded through hours of empty rooms, ordinary comings and goings. And then I hit pause. There she was in the living room with Mike. They were sitting closer than I'd ever seen, her hand on his knee, both of them laughing softly. I felt a hot surge of anger and disgust, but I kept watching, unable to tear my eyes away. Moments later, her hand moved up, resting on his shoulder as she leaned in, their heads barely an inch apart. My heart pounded as I watched her fingers trail down his arm. She tilted her head and whispered something that made him smile, almost shyly, before he leaned in and kissed her. It was surreal, like watching someone else's nightmare. She pulled him closer, her arms wrapped around his neck as the kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I fast-forwarded, hoping to be wrong, hoping this was some twisted misunderstanding. But the images that filled the screen left no room for doubt. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, they didn't just kiss, they lost themselves in each other, right there on the couch in our own home, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My stomach churned, my hands shaking as I hit pause, then rewind, then watch the same moments over and over, as if seeing it multiple times would somehow make it easier to accept. But it didn't. Each time, the betrayal hit harder, carving a deeper scar. She told me I was paranoid, that I was imagining things. She'd made me question my sanity. And the whole time, she'd been with him, my son's best friend, a kid we'd practically welcomed into our family. I closed the laptop, feeling a dark, empty rage I'd never felt before. I sat in silence for a long time after watching the footage, numb and hollowed out, a strange calm settling over me. There was no rage left, just a grim acceptance that I had no choice but to move forward. I knew there was no fixing this. No apology or excuse that could erase what I'd seen. She'd destroyed the foundation of everything we'd built, and no amount of denial or deflection could put it back together. That same day, I began gathering evidence. I copied the video footage, the phone records I'd managed to pull, and saved every shred of information I had onto a secure drive. I wanted to be prepared for whatever was coming. I felt like a stranger, meticulously documenting my own wife's betrayal, but it was necessary. I couldn't risk her twisting this, making me look like the irrational one again. The following morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer, a man named Paul Sutherland who had come highly recommended by a friend who'd gone through a tough divorce. The firm was in a glass tower downtown, sterile and businesslike, the kind of place that felt a million miles away from the suburban life Ann and I had built together. Walking in, I felt like I was entering another world. Paul was a solid, no-nonsense guy, mid-50s with a square jaw and a demeanor that told me he'd seen it all. He greeted me with a firm handshake and got straight to the point, asking about our assets, our kids, and our history together. When I told him about Anne's affair, he nodded slowly, not a hint of surprise in his expression. "Did you bring documentation?" he asked, tapping his pen against his notepad. I slid the flash drive across the table, feeling a pang of disgust at myself for even needing this kind of proof. He plugged it in and watched the footage, his face impassive, nodding as he clicked through each file. When he was finished, he looked at me and said, "This is solid. It'll work in your favor when it comes to division of assets and child custody, but it's not going to be easy." "What do you mean?" He folded his hands, leaning forward. "Affairs complicate things, but you're also dealing with someone who's likely going to fight back. Based on what you've told me, and shown she'll manipulate the situation, make you doubt yourself. This won't be an easy, clean-cut divorce. You need to be prepared for that. I sat there, letting his words sink in. It was one thing to see the evidence and know what she'd done, but hearing it laid out like that, so clinical and detached, made it all the more real. Paul walked me through the next steps, filing the petition, gathering additional financial records, and preparing for the likelihood that, and might challenge the terms. It was surreal listening to him talk about dividing our lives into legal terms, parsing out years of marriage into assets and custody agreements, like we were splitting a business, not a life. Afterward, I left his office feeling a strange weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I had a plan, a way forward that didn't involve tiptoeing around or living with the constant tension of her lies. It wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't keep going in a marriage where trust had been shattered so thoroughly. When I got home, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the framed photos lining the walls. The smiling faces from vacations, birthday parties, anniversaries. Each one felt like a lie now, a reminder of what had been broken beyond repair. A few weeks after filing for divorce, I finally got what felt like a half-hearted confession from Anne. She caught me in the kitchen late one night, her face worn and drawn in a way I hadn't seen before. It was the first time I'd seen even a hint of guilt on her face, as if she knew the weight of what she'd done and was struggling to bear it. "Joel, we need to talk," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I stayed silent, gripping my mug and bracing for whatever justification she was about to throw my way. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I know I've hurt you, but things haven't been right between us for a long time. There are things I need, things I haven't been getting." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "I never meant to fall for him, but he made me feel alive, wanted things I haven't felt in years." My throat tightened, anger prickling in my skin. "So you betray me with our son's best friend instead of talking to me? Instead of even trying to fix things?" She winced, but there was a strange resolve in her voice as she looked up. "Look, I'm sorry. I am. But I don't think ending everything is the answer. Maybe we could try something else. An open marriage. I could have my needs met, and we could still be a family." The suggestion hit me like a slap. An open marriage? Like this could somehow be fixed by just making her infidelity part of the arrangement? I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my voice steady. "You think I'd be okay with that? After everything? Just letting you keep seeing him?" She sighed, looking almost exasperated, as if I was being the unreasonable one. "Joel, it could work if you'd only try. I still care about you. And this way, we wouldn't have to throw everything away. We could even set boundaries, see a therapist, do it the right way." It was absurd, insulting even. But deep down, there was a part of me that wanted to believe there might be a way to salvage what we had. I'd spent 2 decades with this woman. Despite everything, there was history, a family, a life together. And as much as I wanted to slam the door on this conversation, there was an ache inside me that wouldn't let go so easily. That's when I found myself, reluctantly, in a therapist's office a week later. At Anne's insistence, we'd agreed to meet with Dr. Harris, a couples therapist who specialized in infidelity and unconventional relationship structures. The whole thing felt surreal, sitting across from her in a sterile office, knowing exactly where we'd been, what she'd done, and still trying to find something worth saving. Dr. Harris had us outline our grievances, and she listened, nodding along as spun her tale of unmet needs and unfulfilled desires. The therapist turned to me with a gentle but probing look. "Joel, I understand your pain, but I also understand your hesitation to leave a relationship that's lasted so long. Sometimes trial periods, probationary periods, can help couples evaluate whether there's any foundation left to build on. Would you be open to something like that?" It sounded ridiculous at first. A probationary period? Letting her go on, while I waited to see if there was anything left to salvage. But Dr. Harris laid out clear guidelines, a temporary arrangement with agreed-upon boundaries, check-ins, and a focus on open communication. She called it an assessment phase, giving us both time to evaluate whether we could truly rebuild trust or if the damage was too deep. Against every instinct I had, I agreed. I was hesitant, but the thought of leaving something I'd invested 2 decades of my life in felt equally unbearable. I needed closure, one way or another. And maybe, just maybe if we both gave it one last chance, I could find a way to let go with peace. Or, in the best case, rebuild on new ground. The terms were set. 3 months, during which she was free to continue seeing him, but only under strict conditions. We would communicate openly, honestly, and meet regularly with Dr. Harris to assess where we stood. The future felt as uncertain as ever, but for now, I'd give it this last stretch to see if there was anything worth fighting for. It was a conversation I dreaded from the moment I found out, but in the end, it wasn't even my choice to make. Danny discovered the truth in the most painful way possible. He'd borrowed Ann's phone one evening to look something up, and she'd forgotten to delete a text thread. One careless message notification from Mike was all it took. Danny saw enough in that preview to piece it together, and within minutes, he was storming into the living room, pale and shaking, demanding an explanation. "What the hell is this, Mom?" he shouted, holding up her phone, his face a mix of fury and disbelief. And looked stunned, speechless for a moment, her eyes darting to me as if I might somehow save her from what was happening. "Danny, calm down," she stammered, reaching for him. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" he snapped, jerking away from her hand. "That you've been sneaking around with Mike, Mom? My best friend? You're actually sleeping with him?" His voice broke, and the betrayal in his eyes was raw, unfiltered. He looked from her to me, as if searching for someone to tell him this was all some kind of twisted joke. But I couldn't meet his gaze. I felt sick, helpless, watching as he pieced together the truth, and tried to reach out again, her voice cracking. "Danny, please, it's not as simple as it looks. Mike and we didn't mean for this to happen. We just didn't mean for this to happen," he repeated, his voice full of disgust. "Are you kidding me, Mom? He's my best friend. You're my mother. You think that makes this okay?" He turned to me then, his face flushed with anger and betrayal. "Dad, you knew, didn't you?" I nodded slowly, the words barely escaping me. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I'm sorry, son." He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "You're both sorry? That's all you've got." He backed up, running his hands through his hair, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He looked like he was about to break. And he did. He stormed out of the room, slammed his door, and for hours, we heard nothing but silence. I couldn't imagine what was going through his mind, but I knew he felt betrayed in the worst possible way, not just by his mother, but by a friend he'd trusted with everything. It was the kind of wound that wouldn't heal quickly, if ever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and barely contained emotions. Danny withdrew completely, spending nights away from home, crashing at friends' places, and when he was home, he barely looked at us, especially Anne. Our daughter, Lily, who was a few years younger, sensed the shift immediately. She kept asking if we were all right, her eyes full of worry and confusion. She didn't know the details yet, but the strain was obvious, hanging over the house like a storm cloud. A few days later, she pulled me aside, her small voice trembling as she asked, "Dad, what's going on? Danny's acting weird, and you and Mom, you're not like you used to be." Her eyes searched mine, looking for reassurance, but I didn't have the words. I could only hug her, trying to give her the comfort I couldn't give myself. But I knew the time would come when she'd demand answers too. It felt like the house itself was falling apart, each of us isolated in our own private pain, and tried to bridge the gap with Danny, to talk to him, to explain things as best she could, but he refused to listen. Every attempt she made only seemed to deepen his anger, his sense of betrayal. He'd once idolized her, saw her as the bedrock of our family, but now he couldn't even stand to be in the same room. As the weeks passed, I watched helplessly as my family fractured around me. The home we'd built over 20 years became a shell, filled with memories that had turned bitter and painful. In the weeks after Danny's discovery, Ann's behavior started to change. At first, I thought it was just the weight of guilt pressing down on her, the shame of facing her family's shattered trust. But as the days turned to weeks, her behavior became stranger, erratic, and harder to explain. She stopped leaving the house altogether, barely able to look anyone in the eye. She'd drift from room to room, mumbling to herself or staring off into space, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Conversations became incoherent. She'd lose track halfway through a sentence, or suddenly look around, confused, as if she had no idea where she was. She tried to talk to Danny once, to make amends, but her words slurred together, and she stumbled as she reached for him, nearly collapsing. He pulled back, his face twisted in a mix of anger and pity. It was too much for him to handle. I tried to help her, though I was at my wits' end myself. I couldn't ignore the betrayal she'd brought into our lives, but I couldn't just stand by and watch her unravel either. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some resentment, that sick, quiet voice in the back of my mind that whispered she'd brought this on herself. But seeing her like this, lost and broken, was more painful than I could have imagined. Eventually, she began talking to people who weren't there. I'd find her in the living room at odd hours, sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at the door as if someone was about to walk through it. She'd mutter Mike's name sometimes, then Danny's, but it was as if she didn't know who they were anymore. She started leaving food untouched, spending hours wrapped in a blanket, trembling, and her gaze would shift from haunted to empty, as if she were vanishing before our eyes. I called Dr. Harris for advice, hoping she could suggest something that didn't involve drastic measures. But after explaining what was happening, Dr. Harris's voice softened, almost apologetic. "Joel, from what you're describing, she may need more than therapy. This sounds like a psychological break. Her guilt, the stress, it's overwhelmed her. You should consider inpatient care, somewhere she can get the round-the-clock help she needs." The decision tore me apart. And I had shared 2 decades together, built a life of family. To put her in a psychiatric facility felt like an admission of defeat, as though I was abandoning her at her lowest. But I also knew I couldn't handle this alone. The children were suffering enough. They didn't need to watch their mother unravel day by day. And I was afraid of what might happen if I didn't intervene. When I told her about the clinic, she barely reacted, just stared at me with a distant, almost vacant look. She nodded absently, whispering something about needing to escape the shadows and that they wouldn't follow her there. Her words chilled me, the remnants of a person I no longer recognized. The day I admitted her was a gray, dismal day. Danny stayed away, unwilling to see her off, and Lily clung to me, trying to understand why her mother had to leave. I told her as best I could that her mom needed help, that she'd be better soon, but the words sounded hollow even as I spoke them. In the weeks that followed, the house felt emptier than ever. There were moments when I'd wake up, forgetting she wasn't there beside me, only to be reminded by the stark emptiness of the bed. The kids were distant, still processing the whirlwind of hurt and confusion left in Anne's wake. Danny barely spoke to me, locking himself in his room or disappearing for hours. Lily tried to make sense of it all, but she was young, too young to understand the depths of betrayal or the strange twist of fate that had taken her mother away. I visited in at the clinic, hoping to find some trace of the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd once built a life with, but she was slipping further away. She would look at me sometimes, as if seeing me for the first time, her eyes blank, and then mutter to herself, her voice hollow, lost in whatever world she was trapped in. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant, unrelenting ache. It was the weight of watching the person I'd loved fall apart, of not being able to save her from herself. I'd failed to protect my family, and now we were all living in the ruins. The clinic staff assured me she was receiving the best care possible, but as I left her there, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was her prison now, a cage built from the wreckage of choices neither of us could undo. In the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and the house was dark, I found myself sitting alone, wondering if things could have gone differently. If I'd been a different man, or she a different woman, would we still have ended up here? The what-ifs haunted me, replaying like a melody I couldn't forget, reminding me of everything that had been lost to a betrayal that had spiraled beyond anything I could have imagined. After Anne's admission to the clinic, life became a haze of routines and quiet devastation. The house was emptier than ever, echoing with the ghost of a family that had once been whole. I'd walk past the living room where and used to laugh with the kids, past the kitchen where we used to cook together, and each memory felt like a blade twisting deeper. I kept up appearances for Danny and Lily, trying to be both mother and father. But in truth, I was just a shell. The guilt hung over me, a constant, shadowy presence I couldn't escape. I was plagued by questions, doubts that gnawed at me in the silent hours of the night. Had I been a distant husband? Too focused on work? Too tired? Too preoccupied? I'd always believed that love was enough to keep us strong. But now I wondered if I'd just been blind to the fractures in our marriage, ignoring the subtle signs of Anne's loneliness, her growing discontent. I trusted her so completely, never imagining she'd look outside our marriage for what she felt she'd lost. And now, she was lost to me in a way I could never have predicted. I tried to visit in every week, though each visit was more painful than the last. She'd drift between moments of lucidity and confusion, her gaze sometimes focusing on me as if she remembered, other times slipping away entirely. The doctors were optimistic, saying that with time, she might regain her stability. But the Anne I once knew, the woman I'd loved for 2 decades, was gone. What remained was a shell, a casualty of choices we'd both made, but couldn't undo. Danny, too, bore the scars of her betrayal in ways I could hardly comprehend. He refused to talk about it, wouldn't even mention her name, as if erasing her from his mind was the only way he could cope. The sight of her in the clinic, broken and adrift, had hardened him, stripped away whatever compassion he might have held for her. Our relationship became tense, stilted, with both of us navigating the aftermath of a tragedy neither of us could fix. Lily, in her innocence, was perhaps the most resilient. She still asked about her mom, hopeful that one day things would go back to normal, that her mother would come home and we'd be a family again. I tried to explain that her mom needed to get better, that she was in a place where people were helping her, but it was hard to tell a child that her mother might never fully come back. Hard to tell her that the family she'd known was gone, changed forever by choices she was too young to understand. In quiet moments, I'd find myself thinking of Mike, the boy I'd once trusted, welcomed into our home. The anger burned hot, blinding, and bitter, and I'd have to remind myself to breathe, to stay calm for the sake of my children. The damage he'd done was beyond repair. I'd heard that he'd left town after the scandal broke, his reputation shattered. But it was a hollow comfort. The destruction he'd left behind was permanent, a scar across the life I'd spent years building. With time, I came to see that the affair, devastating as it was only the start of what had been unraveling for years. I'd spent so long believing that love and trust were enough, that Ann and I were strong enough to weather anything. But trust was fragile, and once broken, it had consequences that rippled through everything. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd been blind, refusing to see the cracks in our marriage, holding on to a fantasy of what we'd once had while ignoring the painful reality of what we'd become. The truth was, I'd lost her long before that night at the cabin, long before I saw those damning messages or the footage. Her betrayal was only the final blow, the cruel revelation of a fracture I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. And now, all that was left was a hollow ache, a broken family, and a lifetime of questions that would never find answers. Months passed, and I settled into a new routine, one built around healing for the sake of my children. I took them out to the park more, planned quiet weekends away, tried to fill the void that had left. The scars of her absence would never fade, and the anger, the sorrow, it would take years to fully understand and perhaps, one day, forgive. But for now, I focused on the only thing I could salvage, the fragments of a family still struggling to stand. In the end, Ann's affair had cost us more than our marriage. It had taken a part of each of us, trust, innocence, faith. The unexpected consequences of her choices had spun us into a reality none of us could have foreseen, and I was left to rebuild, one day at a time, from the ashes of what had once been a life filled with love. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.